It's intangible with the prediction video. I'm going to be doing it actually for the fights this weekend. Well, one of the fights this weekend. That being between Zach Parker and John Ryder. Now, I'm considering debating doing a prediction on Regis Prograis versus Jose Cepeda, but I've actually found that parity-wise, this fight kind of intrigues me a bit more. As with the Regis versus Cepeda fight, I find that to be a very competitive fight on paper in terms of if you're examining the records of the two fighters or the resume or who, you know, just the performance caliber between the two against similar levels of opposition. However, stylistically, I believe the skill of Regis tips the fight pretty far in his favor. Nevertheless, I found that this fight between Zach Parker and John Ryder does have very high stakes at 168 pounds, a division that's kind of been heating up lately with prospects over the past over the past couple years, several months too, starting to build names for themselves. Mandatory starting to appear in front of Canelo, who currently holds all four belts in the division, but has not had a mandatory called, of course, predictably. So, overall, when you look at the division and his mandatories, Zach Parker is one of them. William Skull is currently the IBF mandatory. Caleb Plant and Benavidez will be fighting a WBC final eliminator sometime early next year, according to the two of them, and according to the sanctioning bodies, as well as Mauricio Suleiman alluded to recently at the WBC convention. And I'm not sure the WBA has a mandatory installed, but among the other three sanctioning bodies, David Morrell, among the other three sanctioning bodies, they've already found potential opponents for Canelo, and Canelo himself has expressed desire to fight in front of a British audience early next year. And supposedly, a fight in the UK early next year would suggest a tune-up, and what better way to tune yourself up when you're at Canelo's level than to fight, a prospect in a Zach Parker or someone who's an established vet who has fallen short repeatedly, sort of at, world level, or, been a recipient of bad decisions, but is also not necessarily on the upswing in his career, and who himself has, even failed at British level to some extent in a John Ryder. But this fight between Parker and Ryder, very intriguing fight in my opinion. Zach Parker is a prospect who's kind of gone through ups and downs over the past few years, and has had his career stalled due to injuries which he suffered in the Darryl Williams bout, which was on the undercard of one of the early World Boxing Super Series cards. I believe it might have been the undercard of Vlasov versus Glavatsky. But he suffered an injury with his right hand in that fight, and his body mechanics were effectively reduced to the point where he could only throw an uppercut. A short right uppercut was pretty much the only shot he could throw that wouldn't basically render him completely handicapped, as he wouldn't have had to get full extension on his arm to be able to generate, any remote power on the shot or lead with the knuckle. And consequently, due to the injury he suffered in that fight, he was pretty much unable to throw the shot, and he was significantly outworked. He was taken to town on the inside. He had really no other weapon besides sort of a panicky jab that he would throw, double and triple jabs that he would hang loose in front of him around his waist to try to keep Williams at bay. Williams, who consequently had no respect for it, was able to lure Parker into clinches and force him to work out of clinches, and he really had no short left hook to be able to deter Williams. Thus, Williams was able to outwork him, and Parker was the recipient of, well, a decision that he was certainly lucky to receive as a result of incompetent judging that really has been displayed all throughout, during the World Boxing Super Series, especially in that second sort of cruiserweight tournament. But with Britis and Gavor. But nevertheless, he's come back since that fight. He fought against Rohan Murdoch. And in that fight, that in my view gave me a better sort of barometer in terms of where he's at. But Parker has definitely improved from the Darrell Williams fight. He seems to be a more confident fighter. He seems to be more confident, especially in his lead hand. He's not just throwing, double and triple jabs, sort of as a last resort, as a panic option when he's getting backed up and pressed against the ropes against a proactive opponent. In his past 3 fights against Alexander and Marcus Morrison, he seems very willing to use his jab as a proactive weapon itself and use sort of step-up jabs to be able to turn his opponents. And as a result, the power has followed. He's been able to set up some beautiful right hands. He's become more confident in his combination punching, putting his shots together. He's become more confident as a pretty regular switch hitter, and Parker has ended up in the past few fights solidifying himself, in my view, as a genuine prospect to watch in the division. He also has pretty quick feet. He's a nice lateral mover. He more seldom backs up in straight lines, and he's more confident in his ability to use angles, as I previously mentioned. And now he's gotten better, and when fighting fellow orthodox fighters, he's displayed the ability to step off and use weak side ankles, which I fully expect him to attempt to use here against John Ryder, the southpaw. John Ryder himself has had a bit of an up and down career. He's been, on the receiving end of many unfortunate decision defeats at domestic level specifically. The timing in which he's fought many of his opponents has definitely not favored him. A split decision loss on his resume, or it was a split or close unanimous decision, something like a very close decision loss to Billy Joe Saunders in 2013. Basically a year before Saunders even had his, big domestic dust-up against Chris Eubank Jr. Definitely wouldn't have looked as good as, had he been able to get him, say, a couple years later, after he had defeated Andy Lee for the WBO middleweight title. Ryder was also unfortunate to lose a split decision, which I personally felt he clearly won, against Rocky Fielding, and once he got his world title opportunity after defeating Bilal Akawi against Callum Smith, he was robbed in that fight, to be honest. It was a very close fight on the cards, a 7-5 type of a fight, maybe 8 rounds to 4 for John Ryder, but when rounds are as comprehensive as they were in that fight, and John Ryder was so dominant and so considerably outworked Callum Smith in so many of those rounds, he left very little doubt in most of the rounds that he had won in the fight, and ultimately finding 7 rounds to give Callum Smith is a near impossible task without excessive bias or just utter manipulation. So, definitely unlucky on John Ryder's part, but you could also say simultaneously that John Ryder's last fight against Danny Jacobs, he was lucky to win that fight. A big fuss was made about the scorecards and the fact that he got the split decision in a fight in which many people felt he lost. But I even felt Danny Jacobs' tactics during the fight were certainly counterproductive and counterintuitive. Jacobs, who had had success early in the fight out of the orthodox stance, pretty much walking John Ryder into jabs at will, being able to smother Ryder as he would try to get inside, and Ryder being unable to cut the ring off as Jacobs, with sort of a low guard and a, extended jab, did not allow John Ryder to really work around any type of construct the way Ryder is typically able to against people with high guards. Jacobs was able to pretty much comprehensively outbox him, but not inadvertently. I can't even remember the word now. I'm losing it. But he basically, for some type of ill-advised reason, decided to switch southpaw and eventually just started getting beat up. And him being on the back nine, coming off of a 1.5 year long layoff from his very close decision victory against Gabe Rosado, heading into the fight, caused him to be rusty, and down the stretch of the fight, his stamina, which had actually assisted him in winning some of the late rounds against Canelo and Golovkin, had then dissipated. So what should have been a pretty comfortable decision victory for him, if his conditioning was up to par as, maybe what it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago, ended up being a disputed decision defeat in which John Ryder his hands were raised in the end. So John Ryder ended up, passing that test. Was a bit fortunate to get the decision, and was fortunate to take the fight and win in the circumstances he was in. Was able to capitalize on it, and now he's getting a fight against Zach Parker, which is a very interesting fight in my opinion, because this is basically a crossroads fight for both. Either Zach Parker wins, and he legitimizes his prospective talent, or John Ryder wins and solidifies himself as a legitimate 168-pounder. And that his up-and-down performances recently, say against the likes of Mike Guy or, the Danny Jacobs life-and-death sort of performance, may not look as bad as many people might speculate. And John Ryder, winning this fight in my opinion, would in my view clearly solidify him beyond European level. Not just as someone who caught fighters under the right circumstances like an inactive Jacobs or a green Billy Joe, a Rocky Fielding who was never competent beyond European level and largely lacked heart to begin with and always had pretty putrid punch resistance. And then a, weight-drained Callum Smith. Now he's stepping in with a young, up-and-coming contender who has basically risen through the British ranks. Apart from the Darryl Williams fight, virtually stainless. What makes this fight interesting to me personally is really the discrepancy in styles. In the fact that John Ryder is a pressure fighter who works best mid to short range, and he himself is going to be giving up a 2-inch reach disadvantage to Zach Parker and also a 3-inch height disadvantage. 5'9" to about 6 feet tall. And Zach Parker likes to use that height. He likes to fight long, and he likes to sharpshoot from long to mid-range. He likes to throw combinations, and he likes to use angles. Zach Parker himself, really I'll just backtrack to John Ryder. John Ryder from the outside is really incapable. He does not have much of a stiff jab. His jab is pretty much exclusively used to set up his straight left hand and to work his way in close. To pick past a high guard, he's very, very good at that. And to back fighters against the ropes. From the outside, in terms of if he's fighting someone who's taller and bigger than him and is able to force him back, he's basically only going to move laterally to try to create angles for himself to get close. He wants to fight at mid to short range, and if he's not in that position, he's really not going to throw any shots of consequence. In Zach Parker's case, he's the more dynamic fighter from different ranges. At long range, he's pretty solid. He can pick some good shots. He's got solid power. And he's rather powerful from both stances. On the inside, he's capable, but he's not comfortable. and he tends to resort to clinch tactics. And he's also susceptible himself to short little left hooks and uppercuts. I remember in his fight against Rohan, a couple of fights after the Darrell Williams fight, he got hurt with a short little left uppercut, I believe in the 4th round. And with the fact that he fights with his hands low, and he likes to pretty much operate on a swivel in his stance, he does become susceptible to some of those shots coming up. You know, especially when opponents can time him with his in and out footwork. And how he likes to lean in once his opponents are starting to crash the pockets themselves, and when he's leaning in for clinches himself, he's susceptible to those short shots. So, I don't really expect him to engage Ryder much on the inside, and therefore I don't really expect him to fight a super aggressive fight. Ryder here is going to struggle because, as I mentioned, he's very, very good at picking shots around the high guard and dissecting it. He's actually world class at it. Fighting against high guards, Callum Smith virtually had no answer for his offensive attack, and John Ryder was able to land with regularity. I'm not even talking about just Callum Smith being able to catch shots on the guard. John Ryder showed the variance necessary to even pick around Callum Smith's guard and evade having his shots blocked or parried. But he's going to be fighting Zach Parker, who's mobile on his feet, and he struggles to cut the ring off against that type of opposition, as he tends to use his footwork pretty much linearly. And simultaneously, obviously he's not quick-footed enough, but he's not going to be operating against much of a against any type of a high guard unless Parker is backed up against the ropes. And Parker himself is not really going to engage him in a lead hand battle for control, which I think would be what John Ryder prefers, because that would force Zach Parker to sit rather parallel with him in the pocket. So I see John Ryder trying to use his double jab, but Parker using a lot of pivots. I see him remaining in the orthodox stance, using a lot of steps to the right to set up his right hand himself. I see him trying to spend most of the fight from the outside as much as possible and staying busy on the jab. And with the fact that this fight is going to be broadcast on BT Sport, and he'll probably have the help of the officiating, knowing his allegiances with the promotional company, they'll probably allow him to get physical within the clinch and rough John Ryder up and use his size against Ryder to be able to smother him. So I don't see them penalizing him for much clinching, which I do think he will utilize quite a lot of in this fight. And I think Ryder will fail to sustain a lot of consistent success. But with the fact that Zach Parker has never really gone the distance at this type of a caliber before since the Darrell Williams fight, in which he did tire out, albeit, you know, he was definitely under a lot of strenuous physical pain, you know, with the injury. John Ryder does have tremendous conditioning and heart, and I do feel as though he will have success down the stretch, and he'll have momentary success himself. But I think John Ryder, with the fact that he's got an excellent up jab, which has had proven success against John Ryder, with his low sort of crouching style, I think John Ryder's going to really struggle to defend against that shot, especially since he's not too much of a bob and weave fighter. And he's going to be eating a lot of shots on the way in to be able to deliver punches on his own. I think he's going to get outlanded in about 10, 11 of the rounds. But I think he'll be able to reel off 3 or 4 rounds by virtue of maybe being able to momentarily stun Parker on the inside, or being able to reel off decent moments in which Parker may look overwhelmed or be forced to clinch, and he'll be able to capture the judge's eyes, or maybe even end up with the more effective work in many of the rounds. But I think Zach Parker's youth and foot speed and angles, and the fact that he has superior hand speed in his up jab particularly, and the way he sets his punches up, is not going to force him to engage John Ryder in the pocket that much. So I'm picking Zach Parker to win the fight, probably 8 rounds to 4. Unanimous decision. A stoppage is possible either way, but John Ryder, in my view, is not a big enough puncher, nor athletic enough to sustain consistent enough work on Zach Parker and keep up with his foot speed, while simultaneously struggling to cut the distance. And Parker himself, while I do think he does have legitimately solid power, John Ryder also has a proven chin, and Zach Parker, in my view, is not going to be sitting down on a lot of shots at around mid-range, unless he's able to get the weak side angle. And I see him fighting a rather circumspect fight and being able to some extent, spoil but also finesse his way to a unanimous decision victory. In which case, I believe Zach Parker will move forward and probably challenge for Canelo's belt in May. So let me know what you all think of this fight. Have a good one.